Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the second and final day of SESYNC's Networks of Networks workshop. We have a set of panels and presentations this morning, and we had a great set of talks and discussion yesterday, and we look forward to that continuing today. Let me introduce my colleague, Dr. John Kramer, who will introduce the first session. Just a reminder, those on livestream, please submit any questions via the chat function on livestream, and we will get to them after the talks.
Good morning, and I also echo Carrie and welcoming you back and saying how great yesterday's sessions were. We're going to start today with a couple talks that are really focused on one of the key priorities of this particular initiative that NSF is developing, and that is the notion of collaboration team science training, in particular an emphasis on thinking how do you build capacity for new generations of researchers who will benefit from Network of Networks activities. I want to start by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Christophe Marchand, who is a health science administrator at the National Institutes of Health and the National Cancer Institute. Christophe?
Thank you for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here with you today. So today I'm going to present 8 characteristics of very successful teams, and I'm going to discuss at the end of the talk how we can manage conflict within some teams. This presentation is based on some work that is compiled in a field guide called Team Science and Collaboration Field Guide. And this field guide, I think you have a hard copy in front of you. It's also available for free at the address teamscience.nih.gov, where you can find a ebook version, a PDF version, and a Kindle version for free. This field guide presents some work that has been done over 10 years ago by Michelle Bennett, who is my boss, and Howard Gadlin, who was at the time the NIH ombudsman. And what they did is that they started to study teams at the NIH, and they wanted to know why some teams were successful and why some didn't go anywhere, when on the paper all the teams looked pretty good on the paper. So in this field guide, you will find those characteristics. So today, in the time I have, we're going to discuss 8 of them. I will be talking about trust, vision, shared vision, expectation, communication, team evolution and dynamics, psychological safety, diversity, and conflict. Before we go, I would like to tell you that my version of my vision of the team or research team here is very wide and very inclusive. It goes from the postdoc with his summer student to the network of networks. Okay, so it's really, really wide. Of course, I spent over 20 years at the bench as a molecular pharmacologist, 18 years at the NIH, so my experience is mainly from the bench side in science. And I would like to start with this slide, which is that the science brings people together, but the success of the team is just not about your science. There are a lot of parameters that are all around your research project, and I've seen a lot of projects, unfortunately, many projects failing because of some external parameters for which we didn't have the right control on. And I can list some that we will be discussing: the shared vision, trust. Are you able to generate trust? Do you have a shared vision? Are you able to have clear expectation? Are you able to share credit and resources? Do you have power in your field? How do you communicate with other people inside the team, but also outside? Do you have some institutional support for your project, etc., etc.? I would like to start by a graph showing that collaboration generates fear. We have all been trained to be here at the bottom of these two axes in the lower corner. We had to show that we were independent researchers. We had to show we had a self-identity along our careers. By accepting new jobs, new promotions, we are, able to. We are supposed to move along this magenta line to a point where we are now we're becoming an interdependent leader. We have to share the leadership with others, and we are looking for high interaction and integration. So basically, we go from the self-identity and the independence to putting the group identity before our self-interest and being interdependent. And, it means that we have to let go some of our status, some of our power, and some of our autonomy. And this is very scary. Some people will refuse to travel this magenta line. We just have to be aware of it. The first characteristic of successful teams are teams that are able to generate trust by their leader, and generating trust is number one in my presentation. It's number one in the field guide, because without trust there is no successful collaboration, period. And why is it important? Because people, human beings, are in two categories, and we could do 50-50, maybe with a bias for low trust when we are talking about scientists. But some people are roughly 50% start with a high level of trust. I am one of this person. When I meet somebody, I give 100% of my trust to this person without knowing the person. The other half of the population is low trust. Before trusting somebody, I'm going to have to see some good action. And the result of this is that if you are high trust, any betrayal or any thing not going in the sense of generating trust will have a very direct and quick impact on lowering the level of trust. I am like that. I could give you some examples where that's it. You didn't act like you were supposed to act for our collaboration. That's it. I'm walking away. There's no way back. And the other people that are low trust, it's going to take a lot of time to generate trust. So trust is like a treasure that you need to cherish. You need to work at it every day within the team and outside of your team. The second important characteristic is having a shared vision. And I think there was a session yesterday from the agenda I've seen on how to build a shared vision in the group. And this is key to success of the team. This is setting the bearing, the route, explaining why, as a leader, we are deciding of this course. And of course, this course can be altered depending on results, depending on all a wide variety of factors. But the leader, when he changes the course, needs to be transparent and discuss why the course is being altered. There are tools and tricks to develop a shared vision. Those are listed here, and basically is everybody in the team, including the person at the lower rank or the lower, I would say, status rank in the team, can everybody describe the big picture? Can everybody describe how their today's action or everyday's action will contribute to the big picture? And this is very powerful. I don't have time to expand and giving you examples, but as a small team leader, when I was at the NIH, when I became aware of that, I started to do the experiment. Anyone coming on my team, I was starting to take a white sheet of paper, spend an hour with them, even if they were high school kids, explaining where we were inside the organization, what we were doing, what could be the impact of a positive results in our experiments, etc., etc. I don't have time to go too much into details, but it is extremely powerful. And those people, if you explain to them the big picture and they get it, their level of commitment and their level of motivation is going to be skyrocketing. I'm not sure if I can say that, but it's going to go through the roof. And it's really, really powerful. And whatever I discuss today, I invite you to try and see if I was right or wrong. The successful teams as well that Michelle and Howard studied were able to set clear expectations. And why is it important? Because it's a tool to generate trust, and it's creating transparency. And being transparent is also a good leadership, I would say, characteristic. And again, there's a lot about communication, a lot about making sure that we discuss everything beforehand. And those are some tools. Those tools are available on the website or inside the field guide. And the collaborative agreement, it is described by Howard as a prenuptial for scientists. So, it's where you put everything on paper before starting. I started my career at the NIH where we didn't do this. We were starting, through email or phone, let's start a collaboration. I will send you my cell lines, and we will do this, that. But nothing was ever written. And then along the years, it became mandatory for us to involve our tech transfer office. And the tech transfer office were able to work on the collaborative agreement. We were only providing the research plan. Everything was clear and clearly stated. It was a kind of painful at the beginning because you prefer doing science than having to write kind of legal documents, but extremely useful, especially when things go south. The welcome letter, it's setting our expectation. I am the leader, I expect this from you. You are coming on my team, you can expect this from me. Interact with me at 8 a.m. in the morning, don't come at 5 because my head is about to explode. Stuff like that. There is a PI at the NIH who have 8 pages welcome letter. Okay? Institutional agreements, I'm going to go fast on this. It's, agreements about appointments, etc. Consortium agreements, data sharing is a big thing right now. It's good to have everything written. Another tool that is not yet in the field guide, but I'm working on it. I gave a talk recently to the University of Pittsburgh where they developed a authorship agreement, which received a lot of pushback at the beginning because it was perceived as a legal document. But with them being able to tweak it as a non-legal document, but just a tool to help, they were able to put this document. And roughly, it lists the criteria for authorships, tentative of authors and their position, role and responsibilities, reason for changing the author. And this document is saved on the cloud, so you have version control, and you can say, I changed this author because now things are different. Journal for publication, tentative dates, etc., etc. I think it's really a nice tool. They got a lot of pushback initially. Then they sent their mentees with this document to their mentors. The mentors didn't like the idea too much. And now, after a couple years, 1 or 2 years, I think, during the first year, it was really a lot of resistance, but the second year worked better because the mentors started to realize that it was a good tool because it was helping them saying, okay, this is the plan. We may have to change the plan, but this is transparency, and this is written. In the lab for many years, I've seen, those not so clear change of directions where everybody asks, why is this happening? And nobody talks about that. So it helps. How do we communicate? So I'm going to try to have this. A small video is better than a long talk. I hope the sound is going to work. Okay, how do I get sound on this? Could I get help for? Do we have sound in the room or not?
I don't know if we're going to get sound because of the live stream, but
That's okay. If we don't, then
yeah, I don't
my,
know.
s- my slides are being shared. So
Sorry.
no, that's fine. I should have checked this myself before. It's a very funny 3-minute video about how we collaborate. And this guy, it is a day before submitting his grant, and he goes to see somebody doing statistics, asking the statistician if 3 patients is enough for his grant application, and of course it's not. And they have a very passionate discussion. So, okay, I'm going back to this. I'm going to discuss briefly the model of team development and team dynamics, because this is a key factor. I never really understood why it was happening, what I was seeing in the lab was happening, and in fact this model of team development explained this very well. Bruce Tuckman in '65 put this together, and he described the fact that in any teams that is being assembled, in order to go to the performing stage, you have to start by the first step, which is forming the team. Then you have a second step, which is a storming step, where people are, rubbing elbows. The expectations, I would say the clear role and responsibilities are not very well established. Then you go to norming. It is where everybody kind of finds its place in the team, and then only you reach performing. And what is very important to understand is that, first of all, and then to finish the cycle, you either adjourn the team because you're done, or you're alterning or modifying the team, and then you have to go through a cycle again. And this second cycle is not very obvious to a lot of people. And being able to recognize that any team, even if they are the most adorable people on the team, will have a storming phase. And this is key, and now I understand why so many conflicts happen in the lab because of this. And I will come back to this when we will discuss the conflict. Psychological safety is key. You need to create in a team an environment where everybody can speak freely and being themselves, from the leader to the high school kid. Because as a leader, you want to be able to capture this crazy idea that you couldn't have thought about yourself because the person is maybe 2 generations younger than you, or something of this. Amy Edmondson is the queen of psychological safety. She has a lot of publication about that. What about diversity in the team? Again, it's a very important parameter because you want different perspectives, as I mentioned, varied experiences, people coming from different horizons, range of expertise. You want a diversity at this level. You want people that are going to challenge the approaches and the methodologies and also the results and how they are interpreted. And there is this famous quote, because, I mean, this is so true. A team of experts is not necessarily an expert team. And we all know that because we have to deal with egos and stuff like that, and institutional support, etc. There's a lot of data about that. I'm going to go quickly through some of the data. Random selections of intelligent participants from a diverse group can perform a team of the best performers. Okay, a diverse group more effective at solving problems than a homogeneous group. You have to consider that identity diverse group will have issues, and you need to work on those issues early on. Again, little collaboration between groups IQ, but if the group includes more women, the collective intelligence raises. And my boss loved this quote. And second one, this mixed gender teams receive 34 50% more citation than single-gender teams, and it's a +1 2013 publication. Managing, I'm going very fast, in fact, I'm sorry. I thought 30 minutes was. So I can slow down a little bit. So we're going to discuss a little bit how to manage conflict in the team, and it's a big issue in the research team of any kind, and how can we manage and contain the conflict. There are two types of conflicts: the affective conflict or personal conflict here, and the cognitive conflict. And it's really a balance. And if you put this in perspective with a team development model, during the storming, you need to pay attention as a team leader to contain and reduce the affective personal conflict. You want to ban this. You don't want people being attacked because they are different on their origin, on their religion, on their sexual orientation or anything. You want, as a leader, contain this. But at the same time, you want to favor people challenging you on your approach on what needs to be done. So it's a key balancing exercise that is very important. Again, we're coming back to the storming phase. And why is it important? Because really, during all my years at the bench, I never realized that when you have a team and the team leader decides to add somebody else on the team, you have to go through all this cycle again. And if you don't pay attention, you can get stuck here. And I had one big example where it happened in the lab, where my boss decided to, we had I would say, performing team. We were developing, in this particular case, antiviral, anti-HIV drugs, anti-integrase. And we had a performing team mainly made of virologists, biologists, white, male and women, mostly American, European. And my boss decided to hire a organic chemist from India. And I didn't see it coming, and it was a grain of salt that in a perfectly performing machine, and then everything went south from this time, because I understand what my boss wanted to do at the time. He wanted to bring the expertise of an organic chemist into a team of virologists and molecular pharmacologists. And we always need a good chemist who is going to say, let's put an hydroxyl here on this molecule and it will make it less toxic or whatever. But, you know, this very nice guy from India was the sweetest guy, started to get attacked and on a personal level because he was different, because he was coming from a different perspective, because he didn't know really molecular biology and stuff like that. And we got stuck. Okay, and I didn't know myself. I was in the middle of this mess. I was trying to do it, but to find a solution, I went to my boss, and we were unable to resolve this. If I could go back several years ago, I would, as soon as the first sign of this shows up, I would be in the office of my boss saying, we're going to have it's going to explode. We're going to have this issue. We need to deal with it right now. And I was unable to do this, and we got stuck. And why is it important? It's because people have different conflict resolution styles. And so some people decide to compete, some people decide to avoid. It's especially true in the scientific world. A lot of leaders are, you know, if it's not about science, leave me alone. I don't want to deal with this. Some people will accommodate, so I will make sure that it's really the opposite of competing. I will make sure you have everything you want. It's fine. I don't need what I was requesting. Some people will compromise, so it's really a basically in the middle, and people will try to collaborate. Collaborate is probably the best approach, but it takes a lot of time. This is from the Thomas Kilmann conflict model. There is a test you can take to see what is your personal conflict style resolution. And everybody, I think, have two majors. One, and what is important to, why is it important here? Because if you know your conflict style resolution, first, you are self-aware on how you're going to behave during this conflict resolution. And second, you can start looking at the people who are around you and what are their style. And depending on that, you can adjust, say, okay, for this one, I'm going to need to compete because we have no time, and I'm, you know, whatever. You will pick the conflict resolution you want. And one way to deal with conflict is to have discussions about undiscussable issues. And I would like to read this quote to you. It's from Robert Schwartz. From his website, it's an article I engage you to read. It's 8 behaviors for smarter teams. It's kind of different than my 8 elements to successful teams, but Roger Schwartz has been working for a while on the mutual learning approach, and it's very interesting. But so he writes, unfortunately, many people overestimate the risk of raising an undiscussable issue and underestimate the risk of not raising it. Specifically, they overlook the negative systemic and often cruel consequences they create by not raising undiscussable issues in the team. And this is touching what I was mentioning before. You can get stuck and not able to move on a very nice research project. It's one of the most difficult things to do because it makes everybody uncomfortable. There are techniques you can use. There is there are different techniques you can search for, but here it's a very simple kind of roadmap to it, and it works. And again, I engage you to try it. And the first time you do it, it feels really awkward, but it works. So the key to this is to plan the conversation, and even for ourselves, make sure that we are clear on what we want to achieve and why we are doing it. The second is let the other person know that you're going to have a meeting, okay, and be clear about your goal. And then, and if you don't know where to start, you can just starting being open and say, okay, you know, for the past 6 months, I've noticed this, okay, and therefore my interpretation of what I see is that this, I feel like that. Can you help me to understand? Is it really what is happening, or could you please? And you ask a lot of open questions, and then the dialogue will start. And this dialogue is important to try to understand what went wrong and when. And what is the most important thing is that you don't want to focus on what happened in the past, but try to decide on what to do next for this to avoid happening again. And by this, I think this is the end of my talk. As a summary, there is no perfect formula. But what was noticed by Michelle and Howard at the time is that leaders in those successful teams were self-aware and emotional intelligence. And starting in professional development by self-awareness is very good, because first you start to know yourself, your conflict resolution styles, the way you work, the way you operate. And more importantly, you start to be aware of people around you. And this is key in your interpersonal relationships. The teams are responsible and accountable, so able to share success, but also being able to resolve issues within the team. Psychological safety, I mentioned it. Again, all those teams that were successful had an environment where everybody could speak, and not only the leader. The people within those teams were able to managing up and across, so across with their peers, able to do a lot of connections and stuff like that, but they were also very good at managing with their boss, knowing how to interact with their boss. It's key. Some people are from the morning, some people are from the afternoon. It's very important to, I knew my previous boss. I could go at 8 a.m. He was ready to fire. It's good because it's my style, so this is how I was interacting with him. Getting a nice result at 3 p.m., I was not going in his office. Next day, said, look what I got yesterday, and then, wow, we had a brainstorming session of an hour or so, and it was perfect. Mentoring is a big one as well. Leaders need to take the time to make the people in their team grow. And I would like to finish by this because it's not obvious, and many leaders forget that. And we need to keep this in mind. As leaders, we are all leaders in the room. We are being watched, and we are being watched closely, and we need to pay attention to our actions more than what we say. And if our actions don't match what we say, we have a big issue. And leading by example, I think it's this leadership characteristic. So to finish, sharing credit. So I presented the work from Michelle and Howard. Howard Gadlin, I work for Michelle now. Howard is now retired as the NIH Ombudsman, and on the first edition of the field guide, which was put on the website in 2010, Samantha was the third author. I was put on the team to help write the second edition of the field guide. And again, it's available at teamscience.nih.gov. Thank you very much. So questions are afterwards.
Thank you, Christophe, for a very interesting talk. Our second speaker is Dr. Selena Connolly. Dr. Connolly is the Education Outreach Manager for New Mexico's EPSCoR State Office, where she is responsible for workforce development and external engagement activities. And across her broad portfolio, she is very focused on STEM education and equity within the community she works with.
Good morning, everybody. I want to say thanks to SESYNC for the invitation to speak today, and also all of you. The opportunity to learn from and with you has been truly an incredible experience. And I have to echo, I think it was what Guy said, was that an opening session like the one we had yesterday doesn't happen very often. So that was pretty exciting. So I'm going to really change sort of the grain size and the maybe the practicality of the conversation now, and talk about early career training that happens within the context of my project. I'd like to give you a little background about me. I'm an educator by training, and I'm also the person, or one of the people in our office that's responsible for actually managing the network. So I'm one of those administrative people that helps our network work, and I'll talk some more about that. Here's our plan for what I'd like to talk about today. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of context about the project that I work in, and I have to say, up until very recently, I probably wouldn't have called it a network, but now I have some really nice words. Thank you, Claire, for giving us those things. And I have to say, actually, over the course of the whole day, it's been amazing to see how some things that I know from practical experience, now I have names for them, and it's really exciting to come up with that. I'm going to describe, in particular, some early career training that we do sort of officially, and I'd like to throw in, I'll put in a few other things that we have to do with professional training that we do with sort of across the participants in our project. And finally, I have a couple ideas about implications for these network of networks. So first off, as many NSF-funded projects do, they start with an acronym. And here's the acronym for EPSCoR. It's actually, they've changed what the words mean. Recently, in the American Competes Act, it went from the experimental program to the established program because it had been around 30 years and somebody decided it needed to be established. So it's a bad acronym that now means something different than it used to. So the states marked in red are actually EPSCoR eligible states, and a state becomes eligible if they receive a certain percentage below a certain threshold of research funding from NSF. The current level right now is actually 0.75%, so less than 1% belongs in a state. So you'll see a lot of the states are in the West, fairly sparsely populated, and as well as are those 3 extra state jurisdictions. Let me talk specifically about New Mexico EPSCoR. And New Mexico's been an EPSCoR state since 2001. And the mission of our EPSCoR is to increase the state's scientific research capacity. So that on the one hand, that means that we're in charge of the entire research capacity of our whole state. So that's one fairly serious mission. And then the way that is enacted is actually through these 5-year awards to support scientific research actually happening in the state. So you can see that we have these dual missions. We're currently in year 2 of the New Mexico Smart Grid Center. So it's a 5-year award. It's a track 1 award, so it's $20 million from NSF, and the state actually puts up $4 million. You can see on the screen the mission for the New Mexico Smart Grid Center. So you can tell that we're really in the realm of electricity management and utilities, cybersecurity, those kind of things. And I have to say, although our project has been around, or my office has been around since 2001, we're really all new with this network. And it was really helpful hearing Christoph's life cycle of the network, and that storming phase is where we are right now. So although our office has a lot of expertise in managing a network, the people who are part of our network are really brand new to this. And so I think we keep reminding ourselves, okay, well, we know this, but there's a lot of training and storming and norming that's happening for us right now. Basically the first 15 years of EPSCoR, New Mexico EPSCoR's existence, we were really in the natural resources area. So doing things like climate change, a lot of geoscience type things, water, the things that you might expect in New Mexico. So for us to be moving from that community into computer scientists, electrical engineers, it's definitely a whole new world for us. I'm not going to get into the science or the research that's happening, but I'd like to talk a little about who is funded and who is part of our network. So EPSCoRs must engage the research universities in a state, and we actually have 3. Although our state only has 2 million people, it's interesting that there are 3 research universities in the state. As well, for us is a community college. There's a workforce training program having to do with the smart buildings and smart grids and those kind of things. And then as well as an informal science partner, Explora. You can see across the bottom a number of collaborators that are not funded by the project but are directly related in are 1 and 2 aspects of it. And I want to draw your attention to the 2 national labs that are in New Mexico. So the national lab funding does not figure into the funding formula for New Mexico. If it did, we certainly wouldn't be EPSCoR eligible because there's an enormous amount of research funding, of course, that goes to our national labs. So our network we talk about our network as being made up of these institutions, but really it's made up of people. And these are our people. This is our all hands meeting the first one we had this past spring. And as I mentioned, we really were making a change from working in one field, one discipline with a certain set of researchers to an entirely new set of people. I think in this picture we have 1 computer scientist and 1 economist who have carried forward with us from the previous project. Here's how it breaks down in terms of the kinds of people that are part of our project. So research faculty, undergraduate students, grad students, postdocs, people who are in charge of outreach and the workforce development pieces, as well as the state office. And I'd like to say that number 8 of people that are part of the state office, that's the number of people, not the full-time equivalents. There's only just a very few of us who actually work full-time on this network. So in total, that's about 140 people. We kept saying, oh, this is going to be a much smaller project. This is a smaller project. We're just starting, so it'll be smaller. But we're surprised to discover that very quickly we've reached about 140 people that are part of this. And I want to talk specifically about the 8 new faculty hires that come as part of this funding, as well as the 8 postdocs. And EPSCoR projects have a lot of conditions on them. A lot of money, a lot of conditions. One of those is a postdoc mentoring plan. Others are mentoring for your faculty hires. And then I also want to remind you of our EPSCoR goal of trying to support the state's research capacity. So we are both trying to figure out how to make sure that these new people in our network are successful in the network and launch into their careers, but then we're also trying to raise the research capacity of the entire state. So that brings me to the specific program I want to talk to you about. So this early career leadership training is something that we've actually been doing over the course of the last 3 projects. So we've had quite a bit of experience, this professional training. What are those things that people need that they don't get as early career academicians? The logistics of it, it's a 3-day residential program. This will feel very familiar to those of you who've been part of this kind of workshop training. About 20 to 24 participants. This time around, we're actually going to try to combine the postdocs and our early career faculty. It'll be interesting to see that because in the previous years, we've actually separated them into 2 different groups because certainly postdocs have different interests or needs than early career faculty, but we think that there's some utility in having those 2 sets of people together. We actually offer this not just to those folks who are in our project, but we open it up across our state and across disciplines. So it's actually a pretty diverse and interesting group of folks that attend this. And then our instructors are drawn from people within the project, but then also folks from across the state. And in fact, we bring a few folks from around the country. Before I get into describing kind of the particulars of the kind of training that we're doing, I want to talk a little bit more about what do we mean by these professional skills. And what we do as a project, we think about where are people, what are their needs? Where are they not getting the kinds of training that we think they need to be successful? Tenure and promotion isn't something that we handle. It's important, but it is something that our institutions are responsible for. And it's also not the science research skills, also important. Certainly for those early career faculty and postdocs in our project, we expect that they are mentored within the research labs and the research groups. Not that these aren't important, but that there's a different way to deliver that. So the things like training on a specific instrument or specific research methods or dealing with things like publication. So what I did to pull this talk together is I thought about the different competencies that are important for those people who are starting off as academics. And the first is, as a leader, how to be a good facilitator. So I think a lot of the things that I talk here actually kind of connect with the kinds of things that Christoph talked about, and these are kind of the practical pieces of it. How do you structure an agenda? How do you run a meeting? How important is it that you start on time, that you take notes, that you make sure that it's made public? Considering about how do you make sure that everybody's voices are heard. And then some strategies for things like brainstorming, prioritizing, how are you going to make decisions. Liberating Structures has a lot of good resources for doing that kind of work. So as an educator, I'm sort of appalled at the tiny amount of training that we provide people who have a pretty significant portion of their career needs to be in teaching. So we do offer some amount of leader as teacher. So thinking about through things like course design, engaging undergraduates in research, ideas of flipped classrooms, using technology in those large lecture classes in terms of clickers, those kind of things. It's not enough. It's clearly that we should provide more, but we do think it's very important that we provide these early career folks with some ideas and set them on a path to be successful as teachers. It was nice to see in Christoph's presentation also about leader as mentor, and what does that mean to be a mentor, both as a mentor, but as a mentee as well. So understanding the values of mentoring and considering New Mexico is a majority minority state. We have a lot of diverse students in our state. It's very important for us to make sure that the public is engaged and that our New Mexico students are going on to work in our project and being successful in the scientific enterprise. So the leader as mentor is an important piece. As an aside, something that we've instituted in our project is a mentoring award. And I've been surprised actually at how much that has really contributed to raising the profile of mentoring within our project. And I can't remember who said this yesterday, but the idea that people get prestige out of working in a network, the people who receive our mentoring award, it matters to them. They get recognized by their dean, by their department chair. They can put it on their CV. And it also signals that our project cares about mentoring, and it really opens the conversation. An important piece, leader as communicator. So in this particular case, we spend a lot of time actually on media training and putting people in front of cameras and having journalists asking them questions and them thinking about those things like their elevator pitch. We structure spark talks and have them stand in front of each other and critique those kind of things. Within our project as a whole, right now we're standing up a science communication fellowship with our local science museum and called Explora. And we're recruiting not just from within our project, but from the state as a whole. And it's been really amazing to see who is interested in being part of that. I think when people think about science communication in the area of museums, they think about how do I talk to kids? Absolutely, that's important. But really, it's how do you talk to people who are non-experts? Not even non-scientists, but just non-experts. And I think I'm really excited to get this off the ground. It'll launch here in a couple of weeks. Of course, proposal writing, important aspect of being a productive academician, being part of our network. So the idea of proposal planning, what do you need to do in order to get something off the ground? A piece that I take on is the designing the broader impacts piece. What does that look like? How many proposals have we read as reviewers that say, oh, I'm going to go and do a presentation in a high school, right? That's kind of the standard for what people expect. And we really try to help people think through what are some ways that you can move your understanding or your learning outside of your individual lab or lab group. And then finally, data management plans, of course, are required in proposals, certainly on the NSF side. We actually do a lot more with data management across the whole network, but we certainly focus on it here within this training. And finally, here's where my kind of scheme broke down. I couldn't quite figure out the right way to phrase this, but the idea that leader are people, and how do you manage things like productivity and stress? How do you juggle the teaching and the research and the service aspects of your job? So providing some real actual tools about time management, goal setting, prioritizing. I think this is useful not just for early career, but really for all of us. So I looked at agendas over the past years to see what kinds of things we'd offered, and it has changed over the course of our projects. Our previous project had much more focus on entrepreneurship, so we had a component of that, including ethics sometimes. Career planning, certainly when you're working with postdocs, a number of them are not going to end up in academia, so how can you help them think about what are those careers? And then, actually, this one made me laugh, the building and maintaining a lab website. Not something that we really need to do, but this is only 10 years ago that this was something that was really important for somebody to learn how to do. So I just wanted to share with you a few things that we're considering based on our past experience and kind of where we are now. One of the foci of this current award actually is thinking about trying to support center level work in our state, that really will be a way for New Mexico to grow. So we're targeting a training for our mid-career faculty on this kind of center management and including a lot of these team science components because we know that human infrastructure is really important. As I mentioned, we're in this kind of norming piece with our teams and are discovering we're going to need to do some actual training within the teams, not just about team science, but how can we make your team more productive. And then finally, also in Christoph's presentation, talking about how do you introduce people to the project. We've really had to institute a pretty formal onboarding process. It's not onerous, but we've developed a video. There's a whole workflow for how people are introduced to the project. And we're realizing you do have to talk about what the big picture is. You can't just assume everybody's read the proposal or that they all have the kind of expertise that you know. And if you think about the 140 people who are part of my project, we're going to have actually a lot of turnover. So probably by the end of the project, we'll have worked with about 300 people. So we just last week launched our onboarding video on our website. I'm really excited to see this. I think it's an 8-minute video, pretty low tech. But what happens after you've done that is that you get a welcome letter from our PI. So that's something I think that we didn't set out to do, certainly wasn't outlined in our proposal, but has become really important as we're thinking about how do we make our network more functional. So I had a little time to think about what would be useful in kind of the next scale of network to network. And I think one of the things for us is considering the needs of the network and the needs of the individuals. Sometimes I need you to do something for the network, and we're going to train you how to do that because there are standards, there are things that we need. And sometimes we're going to offer things that are not necessarily part of the network, but are going to make you a better professional. So thinking through not just, I need to train you how to do NSF reporting because that's really important for me in my job. I have to say people are not all that excited about that. So how can I connect that with something that's really important for their career? I think one of the other things for us is leveraging other training opportunities. We're a little staff. I mean, we're a bigger staff than probably most other networks have, but we certainly don't have the in-house capacity. So partnering with EPSCoR, knowing about the resource that Christoph provides, like that field guide is like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This is a fantastic resource that I'll take back to my project. And something else that I think that my network needs to work on, and it is certainly could be useful, is the idea of these formal mentoring plans. It's often sort of an informal expectation, but really considering not just how are we mentoring undergraduate students or graduate students, because that's kind of the standard, but also how are we mentoring those mid-career faculty or new people who are coming to our project and being both a mentor and a mentee. So I will finish here.
Thank you, Selena and Christoph. We're going to open the floor for questions, but I'm going to break with tradition now and take our first question from the folks out and the remote participants. And this is a question for you, Christoph. Do you have any examples or recommendations on managing the two experiences of trust and how to build trust when it is broken for each type?
I think I will go back to some of the characteristics that I presented. I think it's not really rocket science, but it's very difficult to do. And I think being honest, transparent, and being able to have this difficult conversation, being able to tell someone that, okay, I noticed your actions last week during the meeting, and I really felt betrayal by what you said or what you did, and this is how I feel it. Am I right? Or can you help me to understand what really happened? And sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's just a misunderstanding, and people don't mean harm when doing a particular action, and they don't think about their consequences. So being able to speak about it, and I know it's very difficult, and I've been betrayed in the past, and I didn't walk those steps to go back and say, when you did this, it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I really felt that way, and I felt that this was really wrong, and why did you do this, or help me understand. And I think not being accusatory too much, just being able to express what we feel and asking if what we feel is reasonable, or am I making too much a big deal of this issue. We don't always do this in the research setting, I think.
Questions?
So this is probably for Selena. That's a great outline for training. And this is not a loaded question, this is a curiosity question. Have you been able to do any assessments post-training to see what happened? Like to the PI, the junior faculty that missed the meeting, are they thrown out of the state? What happened?
You know, most of the work we're doing in EPSCoR is evaluation work. So mostly we know, yes, people thought this was valuable. We have done some analysis to look at our new faculty hires and how are they staying in our state and are they successful? And by and large, they are. So in general, EPSCoRs, we feel like we do a great job of training faculty and then we lose them to more popular. But I actually think that's how everybody feels, and we're not any different than all that. So we haven't done a not particularly good research to know that, but I do have. When I went back and I looked at who had participated, I could tell, oh, I know that person because they're successful or they're still engaged in that. So I guess anecdotally I would say yes, but I think there's some really interesting things to be looking at some of those career trajectories. We've sort of mixed things up because we've got postdocs and all of that, but.
Might go back to Christophe or anyone here, really. Science, of course, is grounded in argumentation. And we often have people on a team who some take that very, very much to heart and very seriously, and others really kind of back away from that. And so I'm curious as to what are some really effective strategies that you found to create an open space for an individual that really wants to probe what somebody is saying and ask deeper questions that sometimes somebody who is more reserved might take offense to that or actually go into their shell and then not share. So what are some effective strategies to try to deal with that?
I think one of the strategy that you can put in place is that make sure that everybody around the table is able to speak. And it's not always easy. In a group, there are always these 2 or 3 individuals who have a very outgoing personality and strong personality, and they're going to kind of monopolize the debate or the discussion. And as a leader, the leader may be tempted to only have a monologue or a dialogue with only those individuals because they are they're putting a lot on the table. But I think it's really key to make sure that we create this psychological safety environment where we say, okay, we heard you 3 loud and clear, you're making a lot of noise, but now let's ask the people who didn't express themselves or around the table. And we try to do this. In my work every day, we bring people from, I do research administration, trying to fix things in an institute, so we bring people from everywhere. We have, most of the time, no stake in the game, so, if you want this to be better, you come. If you don't want, that's okay too. But when we have the people around the table, we make sure that we leave at least a space for those people who are kind of reserved or shy to express themselves. And if they don't feel like taking the floor and expressing their ideas, we make sure we offer them a way to drop them by email after the meeting or something like that. But it's key to get everybody's input.
I want to thank you both for your presentations today. Thank you. I have 2 questions. The first is, could both of you comment on what you believe is the most underappreciated skill in the ones that you've been discussing with the most negative impact. So, for instance, what do teams that you work with often just don't think is as important as maybe they should, and that has the most negative impact? And then the second question, it's related but somewhat unrelated. Selena, it always is interesting to me how we sort of expect younger folks, whatever younger means, either earlier in their career or generationally younger, to have more of these soft skill patterns sort of figured out because of the way they, where they are in the, time continuum of researchers. It's interesting, I often find that with researchers, they're not necessarily any better equipped than anyone else. But it brings the point back to the idea of soft skills, which many of what we've talked about in this session sound like, and why they should be considered important skills to scientists, especially developing scientists.
Questions to answer, of course. Do you want to take one?
I can give you my take on the first one. I have been hired by Michelle 3 years ago. Our center is brand new. It has 4 years. I think she was in the center for 1 year when she hired me. And I am very lucky to be part of a team where she has a slide because she's about to give a presentation about our office and what we do to the board, the equivalent of the board of the directors, scientific leaders at the NCI. And she has listed all the training we have done, us as a team, since I have been on the team, and it's a full page long. And because she's a master of that, she knew that we were going to go into storming and that we had to work on the soft skills and emotional intelligence and all kind of those parameters around that. And I think this is the first instant where I've seen this really in full play. And I think from my past life in the lab, anything that is, unfortunately, I would say, anything that is could be defined as professional development and how to improve yourself is not always, I would say, regarded as something that it's worth investing time in. And I think it's a big mistake. And just a word to finish on this, the scientific leaders that I see inside my organization are people very brilliant in research. And they climb the ladder. They start with a small PI team, then they become lab chief, then they become branch or division chief. And in a matter of 10, 20 years, they lead over 100 people from different backgrounds and expertise. And which type of training did they receive in terms of all team science, soft skills, etc.? Zero. And I think organizations and institutions should pay attention to that. And I'm sure that they're trying to. I've been giving talk across the U.S. and I see a lot of initiatives being put together in those terms, and I think it's good.
So I think I'd say that conflict management on every level, on the interpersonal level, on the institutional level, because there's money and multiple institutions part of our project, there's always conflict. And to me, that having skills to do that, and I might be speaking from we're in the second year of this project and that's what we're working on right now, but I do think that that's a skill that serves people well, and there isn't direct instruction about that. And we don't have great models, and it's just hard as humans to do that. So I think for me that would be the place that I think is underappreciated and can also have the biggest impact, because we know that one difficult person in a team can make it impossible to get that work done. But I sort of just to get to your kind of soft skills, and the younger folks might be better at that, or the perception that they're better at that. And Maybe that is interesting. I guess I hadn't really thought about it that way, and I'm not sure that I agree with that, and nor that you were suggesting that was true. But that is the perception, and sort of thinking on science communication. People say, "Oh, well, young people are better at that." Well, they might be, but they're better at social media because that's just sort of the nature of it. But I'm not sure that is really true. It's funny that we push those things, and maybe it's because we say, oh, well, they don't have the research experience yet, so we'll let them be good at something, and they're good at these soft skills. I really appreciated the term that Claire used about learning by osmosis, right? That we really actually should be intentional about the things that we want people to learn. And as an educator, I believe people learn at all times, that we're always learning about things. And if you're not intentional, people may be learning the things that you don't want them to learn, which is the loudest person in the room wins, or those kind of things.
It's a comment and a question. The comment comes from just like the discussion that we're having. In a recent conference that I attended, engineering education, it became clear that these quote-unquote soft skills were becoming important at all levels. From undergraduates to graduates all the way to faculty. And the presenter was saying that perhaps if they're becoming so important and we recognize that they are, we should even change their name, because soft makes it seem that they're less than the hard ones. So transferable was a pretty good term that he employed. He went as far as to say power skills. That was probably marketing on his end, but it was still attractive. The question, Selena, is for the training that you have, are the materials that you use in the form of slides, handouts, tools, homework sets, whatever it is that you use, available to other people?
Let's see. We don't have a systematic way for doing that, but I am for this next set of training really going to advocate that all of those materials are available, because they're nothing that's proprietary, and so we can talk. I'd be happy to share what we have, and then I do think that a service we could do is to make sure that those things are available are through our website and other resources like that. And I just want to piggyback a little on what you were saying about these soft skills. I do a fair amount of work in the K-12 realm as well, and employers, this is what they want. That's what they tell us. We are looking for people who can do these soft things. We can teach them the technical aspect of it, and it certainly is a flip from the kinds of things our schools think that employers need. And I would venture to say, although the academy is certainly different than business, it's not as different as people make it out to be in terms of what skills are useful and important.
Yes, I wanted to ask you, any of you, how do you see the connection between the complexity of the network in which you are operating, right? Number of nodes, number of connections, different disciplines, even geographic, coverage, all the complexity that you might think of, with the team science approach that you are proposing, right? Because in many cases, the complexity of the network actually brings in a lot of complexity for the team relationship, right? And interpersonal skills, communication, soft skills, everything has to be somehow connected, coupled with the complexity of the network itself. So it's like seeing the complexity of the network together with the team science. And then connected to that also is how important is to have a mission, not just the vision, but a mission. We have done a lot of projects for DoD, for example, and there is a clear mission. You have milestones, you have deliverables per milestone, so you know that you need to get to a point on a specific time frame, and there is no excuse possible. You need to get there, right? So how important would the mission also be in the team execution?
So I think one of the things that's interesting about EPSCoR is that the complexity is baked in. We have to have this number of people as our partners, so that it makes it somewhat challenging to start from there, as opposed to, as you're suggesting, starting from the mission or the vision. The goal of our EPSCoR is not just to do the science, although 2/3 of the money goes to supporting the science research. It's also to raise the research capacity of the state. And so that adds another layer of complexity onto that. So I think in part for us, because that complexity is a given, we go into it knowing it's going to be hard. And people are working in teams that didn't naturally develop. I mean, there was some amount. There was about 2 years of preparation to pull this together, but they're not people necessarily that are colleagues. And it's a novel idea. There are many people in New Mexico working on pieces of the smart grid, but the actual full vision of it isn't held by any one person, and it is very complex. And I think what we will see, our output, our scientific output, is pretty low right now, and it's frustrating, and it's very nerve-wracking when you're reporting to NSF. Yes, you've given us all this money, and we're a year in, and here's the publications we can report to you, which were probably were started before we even started our project. But okay, we're going to count it because it counts. But that trajectory and the complexity, it will become more complex as the project grows. One of the things that we've discovered is that 5 years isn't actually long enough for us to see how this investment has changed our state. So now, actually, after 20 years, we have some evidence to show the return on investment and what does that look like for our research capacity. In fact, New Mexico EPSCoR was so successful that last year we graduated out of EPSCoR. So we weren't eligible to apply for any awards. Things have changed, and it's actually not that much money. So now we've fallen back into there. But I think that in an ideal world, you wouldn't set up a structure as complex as what our EPSCoR office is doing, and which makes that mission vision piece really important, and getting people to understand what it is we are all trying to do. And
I agree with what Selena says. I don't have much experience in network to network, just did international collaborations, and so I would imagine that communication would be key, and being transparent in order to generate trust would be very, very important. And I've seen along my career, when you collaborate with somebody across the globe, it's not always easy to have a clear understanding of who everybody is doing, what everybody is doing, and how. So I would put the emphasis on this.
Sorry, hi again. So I really like this conversation, and I appreciate the chance to talk twice in it. And where I'm sitting, I'm very, very supportive of this movement to try to build these human skills and the project management skills and the leadership skills into science. Here's the question that after 15 years of doing a lot of work on this is, it's an additive model right now. We add this to the science, right? So we take a bunch of really, really busy people who are under a tremendous set of incentive structures that make their life kind of tough at times, and we've added a set of skills. And so I'm constantly trying to figure out, what can we take away? So we don't say that only superhumans can do this now. Only the people that can master all aspects of humanity and science are the ones that we want, which I probably do. But so what are the trade-offs that start to happen? Does somebody actually, can they be a terrible team leader and still be a great scientist? Right? Can we allow that to happen? How do we handle the additive model of this kind of approach?
Thank you. So, Gil, are you answering that question?
To the combination of problems that you've talked about. I mean, we're in the same boat. We have, we continue to add. We work with museums, right, and we work with collections managers and folks within the collections. They had a full-time job before we and the NSF decided that we needed to also make these collections available virtually via the web. And so now we're digitizing and doing all of this. We've still got to manage all of these specimens. Museums still don't have any more money. We provided money to do the digitization, but it's the same people that the institution is using because we're not hiring very many people. And if we do hire somebody, it's typically a grad student or somebody that'll digitize for a semester or something. So that's a real problem in our field, I think, across all of the sciences. How do we restructure? Because everything is additive. There's no question. I don't know what we would give up. We were overworked in the museums before we started this. And so now it's, the collections managers have been gung-ho and great and working hard and making it happen, but they're making it happen because they feel passionate about what they're doing, not because we gave them any more time or any relief.
To share an intervention that I witnessed in the past and seemed to work. It's not a big deal, but if you remember the slides with the graph and the yellow, the magenta line, some scientific leaders will never be at the upper right of this line. But I witnessed myself in my institution, the leadership installing a system of awards for younger scientists based on the collaboration. So everybody is free to apply, even if your scientific leader is not really supportive. And if you have the chance of being selected, you receive a small pot of money that allows you to do your project. And the effect that I never really realized when I did apply to that is that even if the scientific leader is not really inclined to go through those, these new projects with new collaboration, because it comes from above with a sum of money, is somewhat linked to do something with this project. So it's a way to generating collaborations and team science, even if the scientific leader is still entrenched in, we do what we do in the lab and that's it. And I've seen many people using this as a way to develop their own collaboration without being blocked by the scientific leader.
So I'm not going to claim that this is an answer to that question, but it's my observation that there are new career paths that have opened up to people with PhDs. And I've seen this already in bioinformatics. There's now a biocuration pathway that are people who specialize in the kinds of informatics work that involves annotating genes, and that they have their own societies, they get jobs. They may not be tenure track jobs, but they're doing it. Similarly, there's people like me who were trained in science to do science, but what I do is really this kind of stuff, and I've been successful in getting funding. Initially, it was all soft money from NSF, primarily associated with broader impacts, but there was a recognition that you had to have somebody on your team to take care of this because the research scientists were busy doing their research, which is what they should be doing. So I guess what I would just suggest, and I know a lot of other people in this situation, we're the ones that go to the same meetings that I go to, and I run into at workshops like this all the time. So there's a lot of us. It's not necessarily a formally recognized career path. It can be a bit uncertain because it's not a tenure track sort of thing. But I will say it's been fairly secure as a career path. There is always a need for this, and if you're good at it, then people will add you to projects. There may not be the recognition that it's as acceptable a career path for PhDs as maybe some other career paths, but I think that's got to change. Who should I give it to?
Go ahead. Just something real quick. I think that we can implement programs, and NSF has done this in the past, that actually address this important and critical skill set. I think in April this year there was an article that went around how in the business community where you might have to fire your most talented employee because these skills are so critically important, and teamwork is critically important to really getting a good product out there. But for example, the GK12 STEM Fellows program that NSF had did an incredible job of improving communication and team working skills in graduate students who were pursuing STEM degrees. And so programs like that, I think, can go ahead and be implemented on a broad scale to ensure that graduate students at that level, in their very early career, are able to develop and see the importance of this skill set. There's always going to be those individuals on the fringe that are just not good communicators, but they're incredible scientists, and we certainly need to have space for them. But I think that the issue is more that we don't necessarily have these strong programs for graduate students in this, when we're training them to be scientists, to actually develop these skills. And I think the GK-12 STEM Fellows program was one good model.
There's some really, this is just a commentary, there's some really good points here. I think I can resonate with Steve's point in that, oftentimes, especially early career people and their development are sort of on this high-speed track, and you're trying to figure out, okay, we have 30 seconds at their next pit stop to sort of, inoculate, and that's it. That was our chance, and we either grab it or we missed it. I think it's really important, too, the comment that was made about trajectories of professions. I mean, it's a lot easier these days to sort of meander in and out of academia, where in another era, that was not the case. You either made it in academia or you worked at McDonald's. That's there's nothing wrong with working at McDonald's, but that's not the scientific culture we live in any longer. There are a lot of career paths, but I think the one thing we can never forget is a lot of what we're talking about in the team science world is to be more effective. It's not really a matter of you have to do it or you don't have to do it. It's so that we don't have to have superhumans in science. It's so that what we are doing can be more effective. It's either allowing people to have happier lives, maybe, in science, or it's so that the scientific work has a greater impact, or maybe, Selena, I'm a trained educator myself, maybe we can learn more from the process of reflecting on how we do science so that we can replicate it. And I think the research that undergirds a lot of what was talked today is really all about that. We researched, do gender diverse teams actually get the 34%, I think it was? Well, that research is important because it's telling us it's not because we're in the Me Too moment in time. That's not the point. The point is the research is showing when we shed the spotlight onto this issue, there's actually more effective outcomes of the research, or the science that we're doing. So I completely get it because I'm in the same world as I think Steve is, where it's like, can you come in and teach everything there is to know about team science in 30 minutes of my class? It's like, I'll try, It's just not in the bloodstream, it's not in the bloodstream, which is unfortunate, but not unexpected, though,
Last word before break.
Great, thank you. So what I want to do is sort of tie some of these pieces together, which are so important, with some of the rationale of why we structured ExcelNet to emphasize the professional development opportunities for graduate students or undergraduates, postdoctoral researchers, and early career researchers, is because the technical training for their degrees is going to happen. They are already in that particular path. We don't need to provide tuition and research assistantships. They're in that pathway. But what is not going to be a part of embedded work is those professional development skills, whichever are likely to be most needed, whichever features people want to bring out. We don't specify that you have to have communications training or you have to have project management training. We want these projects to develop the suite of professional development training that's appropriate for that topic, that fits their network of networks, but collectively we should be beginning to build some resources that people can share, and then hopefully they will not only get the appropriate technical training in their research domain or interdisciplinary training to cross domains, but they will come away with some of that professional skill development that they will be allowed to then build and take their careers ahead in a way that others who don't get those professional skill developments won't have. So I wanted to just reinforce the rationale of the professional development and why we didn't say, add 3 graduate students to your project, but focus your training on skills that all of the early career grad students, postdocs who are part of the network of networks can gain.
Thank you. And please join me in thanking our panelists. We're going to take a break and we'll reconvene at 11 o'clock for the next session. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Welcome back. Our next session is clarifying internal expectations and evaluation. And our speaker for this session is Dr. Jonathan Kramer. He is the Director of Interdisciplinary Science for SESYNC. Previously, Dr. Kramer served as the Director of the Maryland Sea Grant. He has worked to apply new approaches to link science to policy development and decision-making in the environmental arena. Of particular interest is the use of facilitation, synthesis, and consensus building to help address critical issues in the coastal arena, as well as the development of effective science outreach mechanisms.
Thanks, Carrie. I think it's probably fitting in a number of ways that talking about evaluation comes at the end of this particular workshop. In a lot of ways, evaluation is looked at something we must do, though it's oftentimes onerous and particularly stressful. My hope today is that we can talk about that in evaluation in a slightly different way. I'm also very aware that everyone in this room has probably a very rich history with assessment and evaluation, and the field itself is complex and diverse, and I won't do it justice in the amount of time I have today. There's not a magic recipe for telling you how to do evaluation for standing up a new network of networks. And so I'm not going to be able to give you that. What I will try to do today is give a broad overview of the field of evaluation with some hints as things that might be useful. And I hope that we can use that as a stepping off point for a conversation amongst us all after I get done about your ideas about what might be useful, your experiences in evaluation that might be relevant as you stand up these new networks of networks. If there's one theme that runs through this in a variety of ways is, for me at least, in my own experience with evaluation, is that evaluation is a research endeavor in its own right. And understanding why you evaluate is as important as understanding the measures you take, the things you look at, which we tend to jump to. We're going to measure this without really thinking in a lot of ways of why we're measuring and why it's so important to measure. So just to start, my plan is to talk a little bit about some essential resources, touch on organizational structure and capacity, a little bit about aligning expectations, to talk about program theory, utilization-focused evaluation, and then this notion of a culture of evaluation inside any network or any kind of organizational endeavor. If I can do anything at all to start, it would be to point you to some essential resources. And if you haven't seen these, it's worth picking them up. Both of these books are really particularly readable and interesting and bring a perspective on evaluation and program design. And I'll try to use those terms somewhat interdependently because that's the way I see it. And I suspect those of you who have done a lot of evaluation think about design and evaluation and working hand in hand. But they're both classics in the field. The first is Purposeful Program Theory, Effective Use of Theories of Change and Logic Models by Sue Funnell and Patricia Rogers. And the second is Essential of Utilization-Focused Evaluation by Michael Quinn Patton. As I said, they sound like these are really going to be dry and awful books. They're not. And I'll refer to these numerous times over the course of the next 20 minutes or so. And I would really, if you haven't picked them up, they're certainly worth the investment. We've heard a lot over the last day and a half about the aspects of organizational structure and the notion of what capacities will be needed to build networks of networks. And each of the networks that will be built will be unique in their own right, and there'll be opportunities and challenges that you will have to achieve or face over the course of the years of your funding. And at the key to all this is, what's your vision for this? What is the vision that you hope to achieve, and over and across what scales? But what goes beyond that, and I think I'm echoing much of what you've said, is the organizations you build and the actions you take are going to be essential to getting there. That sounds almost naive, but it really is. It's all about the organizations, and it's all about the intentional actions that you want to take. So thinking deeply about how you match organizational structure and implementation activities to your intended outcomes and impacts is key. And as we heard numerous times over the last day and a half, can you see and articulate how your new network capacities will enable you to achieve those outcomes? It's worth at the start to go back to the very beginning of this, the impetus of this, which is what Claire talked about and what NSF is putting on the table right now. NSF has clear expectations for what they believe that networks of networks should achieve. Progress in scientific discovery, international engagement, leverage resources, development of professional skills, and touching on those big 10 ideas. Those are all really worthy and important goals, the kind of goals that demand a national investment. But the other part of expectations is to understand what will be catalytic to your networks. It's not just the ideas, it's not just the vision, it's what resources you're going to have. And so to think very carefully at the front end about $750,000 over 3 years for catalytic and about $2 million over 5 years. Sounds like big money. It may not be huge money. I see Claire shaking her head there. Your aspirations have to be calibrated to what is available to you. There may be leveraged funds, there may be other kinds of things you could do, but in any sense of as you stand up an organization and ultimately design it, and ultimately afterwards evaluate it, this becomes key. And so understanding that, these guidelines is really the first step in that. So how programs are designed has been the subject of research and a variety of practice over many, many years. And much of this is bundled under the general heading of program theory. The notion of a program theory has been around, and it has its own language now. It's a, you know, I wouldn't necessarily call it a discipline, but it's a way of thinking about evaluation. If any of you really have not looked into things like the American Evaluation Association and others, this is a big community of professionals out there who think about this, do research in this arena. The two textbooks are sort of done by people who are considered sort of iconic figures in there. The terms Funnell and Rogers use, and these are the ones that are really key, and I want to talk a little bit about this now. This notion of a program theory is an explicit theory of how an intervention is understood to contribute to its intended or observed outcomes. So how an intervention is understood. That term intervention is interesting, and in this case an intervention is standing up a network of networks. A lot of this work comes from studying NGOs, studying social change organizations, not necessarily knowledge-producing organizations or capacity building in the same way that you're thinking, though the stretch actually in my mind isn't that far. Whether you're looking at healthcare, whether you're looking at social change, some of what you're going to do is really all about social change and different ways of doing business. So there's an overarching program theory. Then there's a theory of change, which we've heard someone talk about that yesterday. That term came up. The theory of change is the central process or drivers by which change occurs about for individuals, groups, or communities. What is it that you intend to change by building this network and network? And then there's a theory of action, the ways in which programs or other activities are constructed to activate a theory of change. So think about that. So there's what you want to achieve, a theory of change. And change, in my mind, is actually really important. We tend not to think about change. We think about looking at things we can count. But in effect, NSF is asking us to do not just things that you can count, but to change pieces. And a theory of action, why is it that your activities are logical and will lead to the changes you really care about, what you're trying to achieve? And then there's logic models, which are a representation of programs, intervention by specific key steps, programs, activities, et cetera, and the outcomes in a sequential manner. And usually these are shown in a diagram. Just to go a little bit deeper on components of a program theory, what is in a theory of change? These are the main components. It's a situation analysis, identification of problems, causes, opportunities, really thinking about causality, focusing and scoping, setting up boundaries, of the program and linking to partners, that notion of boundaries is absolutely essential. Not just because of what you have for resources, but because of the scale of problems that you want to be able to actually effectively tackle. And then somewhat of the centerpiece of a theory of change is an outcomes chain, linking the theory of change and the theory of action. So again, theory of action, desired attributes of intended outcomes, attention to unintended outcomes or consequences, program features and external factors that will affect those, understanding those pieces, and what the program does to address key programs, elements, and the external factors. So the notion is being very intentional in program design, really thinking carefully, and as setting this up will lead you not only to more effective programs, but better evaluations as you go forward. I want to touch just briefly about logic models, and my guess is you've all seen logic models in some sense, and I see people cringing a little bit about logic models. I have to admit, when I first started thinking about programs beyond a research laboratory, I hated logic models. I thought they're really confining, they're really restricting, they're overly simplistic. But the reality is they're the start of something. They're not, oftentimes not the end of something. And they're just a way to help you represent to a variety of stakeholders, internal and external, a piece of what you're thinking about and how you're thinking about. So logic models are tools, no more, no less, and they can be remarkably useful if deployed in the right way. They can be really simple, from an intervention to short-term and long-term outcomes, or they can be a little bit more complex and are oftentimes called pipeline models, where there's some sense of linking from inputs to activities to outputs and ultimately long-term impacts. And again, you know, the level of complexity can be calibrated in a variety of ways, but they're simply a tool in a toolbox that will be used for thinking about program design and evaluation. So this is a little more complex logic model. There's activities at several different levels, at a high level all the way down to, in this case, this is called a client level, an individual or an individual program, a set of nested outcomes that ultimately lead to long-term outcomes. What's different about a logic model versus a program theory or a theory of action is it doesn't actually explicate intent and the logic behind it. It's just a sequential list. So they don't generally show how a program understands causality, and that's really important. This notion of causality is really key. One of the things that I tend to like about program theory and even logic models, though I don't use them very much anymore, is they're very scientific in a lot of ways. This represents this, there's a notion of experimenting within this. You're setting up an experiment, you're thinking about how to move forward through a chain. We talked earlier, Margaret talked earlier on about SESYNC as the center as experiment. There's a logic to how we set things up. There was a theories that we were testing, and we moved through a series of activities that we tested over and over again over the course of our time. And so to me, that's appealing in a scientific endeavor. It may not work specifically for what you want, but there is this notion of a deep research process that's embedded in these kind of things, a research culture that's embedded in thinking about this. I want to give a couple examples now, moving from logic models to theories of change. And you know, I went on the web, and you can find lots and lots and lots of these. They're all over the place. And I picked a couple that I thought were interesting. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but I'll talk about these two just in general. The first is something called WOCAN, Women Organizing for Change in Agricultural and Natural Resource Management. This is a women-led international membership network of women and men professionals and women's associations. And it's focused on a variety of different agricultural and natural resource issues. And this is their theory of change. And so in a lot of ways, it's somewhat simple. The graphic is somewhat simple. It looks somewhat like a logic model. But what makes it really different is not that just as is embedded in just this activities, outputs, outcomes over a time frame. It's the language on the right side of that screen that I think makes it really powerful. The theory of change describes our understanding of progress that progress in women's empowerment and gender equality requires changes at two levels, individual women and women's groups at the community level that experience a change in their conditions and positions, organizations that can have influence and support women's empowerment and gender equality through their policies, financial allocations, and plans, creating enabling environments. So the sequence from activities all the way through the top is embedded in a theory of what those activities will do and will achieve. So that to me, it's a marrying of a visual representation and text. Here's a second one. And this is from something called Ecosystem Services for Poverty Alleviation, ESPA. And I don't expect you to read this, and there's no intent. But what I want to do is to simply contrast this one with the one before. This is much more complicated, both visually and what's embedded in here. And so everything is in this diagram. And what you have is a temporal sequence going from the bottom to the top, shorter term to longer term. You have assumptions in some of these bubbles here. There's expectations of what each of these activities will achieve. And there's linkages and feedbacks across all of this. So there's two different ways of thinking about these. Are they simple theories of change and represented that way, or are they much more complex theories of change that are represented that way? This is actually really fun to look at. If you'll have the slides and the link will be there, but there's lots going on. ESPA's not around anymore. It was and I should give you a little more detail about that. ESPA was a UK organization that was around for about 9 years, and it was focused on connections among ecosystem services, their dynamics in management, and human use pathways for poverty alleviation. That sounds like a network to me. It developed innovative interdisciplinary research methodologies. It engaged and communicated effectively. It supported many projects worldwide. So again, don't focus on this, but the details, but the notion of this is quite different than the one you just looked at before. So the other thing I want to point out about ESPA's theory of change is that blue line really near the top where the red arrow is. And what they characterize that as the boundary of ESPA's influence, which I think is really interesting in that they looked across time from early stage activities and short-term outcomes and impacts to longer term, they recognized that they weren't going to be around forever. They recognized there was a point, even if they aspired to make change, that they probably wouldn't be able to claim credit for that change. So they knew and they planned that these activities would be set in motion, and they would probably not be able to say, we actually did this, but we knew that we had this boundary of beyond which we couldn't be accountable. In our own center here, in our own theory of change, we have what our evaluator calls a horizon of accountability. There's things we really care about doing. There's things we really hope we will inspire change around, but we know we won't be around long enough to actually to see those changes and necessarily claim credit. That's that boundary piece again, and that's why these kinds of activities are so important, not just to program design, but ultimately to how you evaluate. So what are the uses of program change, theory of change, and theory of action? Certainly, planning is really key. Situation analysis, strategic activity development, strategic planning, development of specific kinds of interventions and the strategy beneath them, and ultimately as a management tool for helping everyone develop a shared vision who's associated with a project, understanding how individual contributions are integrated, communicating with stakeholders inside and outside of a program, and finally, for developing monitoring and evaluation strategies and metrics. I'm going to turn from program theory now to what Michael Quinn Patton will call useful or utilization-focused evaluation. And I think it's really key to think about some principles for that. When you begin to do evaluation, if it's going to be useful, there's a variety of things that you really should think about. And I'm going to just go through these because I think they're really useful. This is from Quinn Patton's book. Identify outcomes that matter to those that do the work. Distinguish between outcomes and activities, not the same thing. Be specific. More specific the outcomes are much more powerful than less specific outcomes. And each goal that you develop should only have one outcome. Outcome statements should be understandable. Formal goal statements should focus on the most important program outcomes. State outcomes separately from how they are to be attained. Separate goals from indicators and performance targets. This is really something that's really interesting. We tend to talk about goals and the indicators, but the reality is goals are very different than the indicators, the ways you measure them. And I always thought this was a great one because we tend to do this all the time. Don't copy goals from other programs. It really it focuses on this notion that how unique what you develop will be, how important it is that you really think deeply about what you want to. And use outcome statements to stay focused on achieving results. So all this sort of cues up this notion of different forms of evaluation. And I want to talk a little bit about this. And you know, the list here, summative, accountability, monitoring, formative development, and knowledge generating. I'll talk a little bit about each of these. But the reality is we tend to focus a lot on the ones above the blue bar there, for a whole variety of reasons. This notion of, and then the ones on the other side, which for many of us, when I first started really thinking about evaluation, these were new words to me. I didn't understand, never mind the processes underneath the hood on something like formative or developmental evaluation. But I want to make the case that whether you think about them in sequence or you deploy them in different ways, that across this spectrum, these are all really important to thinking about evaluation. So just a little bit of detail. Summative evaluation is something we've all heard a lot about and probably all experienced in a variety of ways. As a program reaches completion, as you reach a certain milestone, what's the overall things that have been accomplished? And it helps you answer questions like, what's the merit of the program overall? Have stated goals and intended outcomes been achieved? And how does the program compare to peers or a reference group? These are all really important things and tend to be important to a variety of different stakeholders. Accountability is very real in a variety of ways. We tend to think about this in a resource or financial context. Is the money being spent well? Are we honoring our fiduciary responsibility? But it also tends to focus on who is accountable to whom and for what. Are there rules and regulations beyond fiduciary rules and regulations that must be adhered to, and for all the right reasons, compliance? And it can get you into a cost-benefit analysis. And then there's monitoring, sort of more real-time, in-stream monitoring. To what extent are outcomes being attained? Is there routine monitoring of key activities? And is information actually being analyzed? Are you collecting information? Are you doing anything with it in relevant time frames? But moving beyond this, formative evaluation, particularly these three, formative, developmental, and even knowledge generating, are really relevant in complex systems where there's a high level of uncertainty around the surrounding environment where a program exists, and as a particular program is stood up and develops in those complex situations. So formative evaluation, how can the program be improved and over what time frame? And beyond formative is developmental evaluation. Is organizational development and rapid response a key part of the program? Is this really how the program should be stood up? Are you really focused on a program that has to evolve? Is the program situated in a highly dynamic and complex system? Those are really interesting things that I think perhaps are very useful in the early stages of a project and may be part of the project culture beyond just the early days. Formative and development were absolutely key for us when we started from scratch here at SESYNC. And finally, there's a very research element in assessment and evaluation that could be all about knowledge generation. What have you learned, and what will it tell others who want to go down this road in the future? I want to just touch on this briefly because I think it's really important. Across all of these different, the spectrum of evaluation, there are intended users, and I won't go through all these, but there are also different stakes in these evaluations. Summative evaluation is often considered the very highest stake. What have you produced, and will we fund you again, or can you showcase to those who administer you that you've really achieved what you're supposed to achieve? And it goes down the line. The one thing I somewhat disagree with is that developmental evaluation is low stakes. I actually don't believe that. Having lived through development evaluation and having used it as a tool, I think it could be quite high stakes because it really places a high emphasis on adaptation, adaptive management, and developing staff who can work within this context. So I'm going to just jump past this. as you begin to frame an evaluation, as you begin to think carefully about what evaluation can do, ultimately, these are research questions, and there's some guidelines to thinking about how you might inform an evaluation. So another set of from Quinn Patton's book, thinking about the questions you might frame. Can they be answered sufficiently to inform understanding and support action? They shouldn't be nebulous questions. They should be really clear questions. Can they be answered in a reasonable time frame and at a reasonable cost? Is there data that can be brought to bear on these questions? You know, this sounds like basic research, but the reality is lots of evaluations you can't answer those questions. You want evaluations that can be focused on answering questions. Are the answers biased, or are the outcomes predetermined by the phrasing of the question? The primary intended users, do they want to know the answers to these questions? And is the answer actionable? Can you do something once you've learned something? Can you take a step beyond that? Can you make a change afterwards? So finally, to sort of just do a little bit of wrap up here, I want to go back to thinking about networks of networks. What might you measure? What might be important to you as you begin to stand up your programs? And so what are the kinds of things that a network should do? What are the things that are important to a network? And this is just from a reference that I pulled, and I thought that was actually quite interesting. Networks are a way to filter. They organize various types of information so it can be useful to a variety of stakeholders. So this filtering function is often hidden beneath the surface, but it's actually really important. So that's something are you providing, your network's providing and filtering information, synthesizing it in a logical way. Networks amplify. They take an idea or concept and move it from a private or even highly complex state and transfer it to stakeholders, both internal or external, to publics of various kinds, communities. Knowledge transfer, are they achieving that goal? Networks invest and provide a whole variety of different kinds of resources, both financial and human. Is that happening? Is it happening in a logical way? Clearly, networks convene, and that's a somewhat easy thing to measure. They bring people together in a variety of real and virtual ways. But I think the interesting thing about convening isn't just do you convene, but do you convene with a purpose? And is that purpose linked to your mission and what you want to change? And can you assess that? Are these convenings useful, and are they adding to the overall mission and change? Certainly building communities. What are the nature of those communities? Are they durable? Are they interactive? What kinds of things come from there? And then finally, networks facilitate in a whole variety of ways. Physically facilitating interactions, interpersonal facilitation, all these pieces are part. And I think mechanistically, are you seeing the role of facilitation in networks as being things that are valuable, adding value to those who are part of the network? So understanding the impact of these kind of operational functions can be an important area for you to look at and develop questions around for evaluation. There's some other things to think about and possible foci for evaluating networks. I like the term vibrancy, and I think that's a really interesting concept for a network. And vibrancy has a lot of different pieces to it. Is there a clear structure and governance in your network? Is it transparent? Does it work? Is there ownership of the members of the network? Are they engaged and staying engaged? There's ways to measure that. Are there a diversity of interactions? Are there ways that you can look at and see who's interacting and how? Are they coming from different disciplines? These are international networks. Are they stretching beyond? Are the interactions really localized, or are they truly international? Are you developing activities and ways of thinking and convening that show interdependence, people actively seeking to collaborate in new ways? And is there an alignment around what's being produced, alignment around the kinds of activities and the kinds of scientific knowledge that's being developed? Cohesion is also part of alignment. And then finally, because I think a lot about this here, is there adaptation and evolution? Over time, as the networks that you've catalyzed, are they changing? Are they developing in new ways? Are they growing? And there's lots of different ways, formal and informal, to assess that. Another set of evaluation foci, connectivity. Are there good communication practices being developed? Are there effective activities? Is the quality of communication strong? Who is participating and for how long? Again, I like that word durable. Are there sustained and durable interactions? What's the level of collaboration? Is there willingness to work together? And is there coordination? Is there a link between the governance and your organizational structure, the strategies, and then ultimately network connections? So much of this doesn't sound like counting things. So much of this sounds like pure social science research. And I would argue that's what it is. And I'd argue as you think about the complexity of your networks, to have someone who can help you think along these dimensions and measure along these dimensions. That's not to say that there are not things you are going to count as you think about your the products of your networks. We heard Selena had the story about the utter fear of not having lots of publications in the first year. I would tell you we've lived that here. It's daunting, and it maybe have been daunting for you. There was a big investment in this center. We didn't see papers for almost 2.5 years. It was really scary. But those are things you can count. There's the currency of scholarship. The papers produced, the talks given, the bibliometrics around those. What are the nature of those? Are they the same or are they different? Are those who are producing those papers changing what they produce for the collaborations that you've inspired? Are there media hits? Those are often things. But there are other pieces that you can count too. We heard a little bit about career development. Is there capacity building for early career scholars and certainly for more senior researchers along? Ultimately, those are the kinds of things you can measure. But underneath all that, and I'm sure this won't be a surprise given what I've been talking about, is there value added by having this network? Have this network or your networks of networks shown influence in the focus area of the networks? Are you beginning to see a shift within the scientific domain that you're attacking? And then finally, is there systemic change? Going all the way back to this notion of theory of change. What did you want to change? Are you beginning to see change occurring? 5 years seems like a long time, and I worry a little bit that it's not. And 3 years to catalyze something, our own experience is it takes time. But linking to a theory of change is really quite critical. So I'm just going to end where I started and say that I'm hoping we can have a conversation. But I want to ask you to think about this. It's true that for all of us, I suspect, evaluation can be incredibly stressful. It can be the onerous task that somebody has to do. In the end of the day, though, it's also something that if it's done well, if it's done in a research context, it can really shift an organization's thinking and a culture in an organization to be intentional, to be self-assessing, to really care in a different way about how you do business. And I think that's somewhat inspiring. It can be data-driven in a whole variety of ways, but in the end it's knowledge-driven, and it can help you produce learning organizations, which I think we all aspire to. Thanks very much.
So we have time for questions from the audience.
So way back then, fooled around a lot with total quality management, and there was some really good books on that, and that sort of goes along with program theory and designing organizations and how to make them function. And I always had the impression that the books that were written by the experts were really good, but that what they were espousing was really their intuitive understanding of how the world works. And so they were really good managers, but they were really good managers almost by nature. And so they would share all of this in the books, and it was all helpful stuff. But I just wonder, do you get that same sense with theory and with program theory and all that? There are people that do that just sort of the way they are? And is it teachable?
Yeah. So my experience, I would tell you, I've never interacted with so I'll talk about just the two different references I gave, and those are the experts that I tend to think about. I don't know Fennell and Rogers at all. I actually went to a workshop with Quinn Patton around development evaluation as part of a meeting that was here in DC. And my sense is he was a researcher, and he thought more, and I don't know if he's managed. I don't know his biography that well, but my sense is he's thought very deeply as this is a research problem. And so he studied a variety of different organizational settings. So for me, that made his work more powerful. That it was, he's charismatic, he's really strong. I bet he would be a good manager, but he thinks organizationally and has looked at lots and lots of organizations. So that's one piece of the question. Can it be taught? I think two things. If you have someone who's really invested inside an organization, and I would argue you have to create space and resources for this, that's really important. And they can be a change agent inside an organization. It might have been you over the years, and so that's one. But the other part of the puzzle is it's oftentimes very valuable, if not essential, to have an external evaluator. And that's the balancing. They are professionals, there's training, they get degrees. Sometimes they're social scientists to start. And so it's always that balancing. And again, this comes down to a resource issue. Bringing in an external person is expensive. For us, it's been very, very important, particularly around things like theory of change, to have someone who's not facilitating that conversation internally. That's a key piece to think about in the early stages of as you stand up new kinds of programs and organizations.
And you would argue that embedding evaluators within the organization is better than hiring an outside. We have that discussion all the time, and we've done it the previous way. Seems to work great, but you never want to feel like you're tainting the evaluator by them being part of the staff and they want to satisfy you and all of that. I don't think we've had that, but I'm just curious.
I wouldn't argue for that. I'd argue for an advocate for evaluation and someone who is. That sounds funny, doesn't it? But there's someone who is really thinking deeply about evaluation, and if you can, then have an external evaluator, because then having an internal liaison, someone who is a champion for evaluation internally, not doing the evaluation, but helping to think through the evaluation. And of course, our experience is our evaluations, and we've had 2 external evaluators, there was a lot of interaction about what do we need to evaluate, why are we evaluating it, let's develop the questions jointly. So it didn't become someone parachuting in and saying, I'm not, it wasn't an external evaluation, it was an external evaluator. They're 2 different things entirely. And I think discriminating those is really important.
I asked this question because I didn't see a disclaimer, do not try this at home. Sometimes when writing a proposal, considering a project, one has to think, do I try this myself with, frankly, the little we know, because we're not, experts on this, or I don't think most of us are. Do I bring in an external evaluator? And the cost of that, sometimes is, how it works. So do you have some wisdom to share in that regard? Is there really that disclaimer and it was just like small print? Or would you say, you can do it. It will be difficult, it will take time and effort, but you can do it on your own? Or no, do not do it at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the disclaimer's not there because I think, and I'm sorry if I didn't make this clearer, I think you have to step back and say, what are we evaluating for whom? And so evaluation could be as elaborate as the kind we go through here and others do. We have resources, we're big, we have lots of things going on. And we have stakeholders who want to know, many of internal stakeholders, because we want to learn. But for smaller organizations, if you're calibrating what you want to do to the level of evaluation is really key. So so I think my answer is yes, you can do this. If you start with what do we need to know to make us more effective? What do we need to know that will help us reach the change we want to achieve? Could that be a very elaborate, externally driven evaluation? Absolutely. Could that be internal and adopting practices that help you collect the right kinds of information? Yeah. So I think it's that front-end calibration that's really essential. Not all of these are really really complex evaluations. Some of these questions can be answered in a variety of ways. Doesn't mean it won't take time, but some of those are not, massively data intensive. Some of these involve your staff. Some of these involve things like surveys. So it's all about calibration. I wouldn't be put off by the thickness of the books. I wouldn't be put off by all the verbiage on those slides. I'd say, what do we need to know and for whom? And then how do we calibrate given the resources we have?
I guess I've learned to embrace evaluation. I like it. It's one of those things where you dread having to do it, but when you go through the process, oftentimes you're rewarded by, wow, we did some cool stuff, and we satisfied the funding agency at the same time. And, I think that really good grantsmanship requires that we're dealing with all of these things that you brought up. Why is it that you want to do something? You lay this out. What are your approaches? What are your anticipated outcomes? And if you don't get those outcomes, how do you adapt? It's all built into there. And then even within the evaluation framework, especially at NSF, you do your annual report, you go through and you look at this and, what was the impact to broadening participation or to workforce development or to your field. And I think if you look at what you have to report as you're writing the proposal, that can really guide you in your proposal writing. So if you are paying attention to what your deliverables are to the scientific community as well as to the funding agency when you write your proposal, this is all built in. And it makes the evaluation then quite easy. And you go back to your proposal. What was it that we really said we were going to do? And are we doing that? And you can do that in your monthly PI meetings or your once a year at some gathering or whatever. But I agree with you that it isn't really all that complicated. We just have to play heads up ball in this.
I think a lot of that's true. I agree with you. And I think because of the nature of the funding and what NSF asks for, you have to do that. I think that's absolutely true. But I also think that where it gets tricky is when the situations are complicated. And in a lot of ways, I think networks of networks have the potential to become more complex. And that notion of adaptation is really pushes you in a slightly different way. Are we, could the goals, so one of the questions is, when you write a proposal, you think we're going to achieve these goals, and it may turn out you can't for a whole variety of reasons. There's externalities, there's forces that have pushed you away from that original intent. Some of that's storytelling, and some of that's interacting with the program officer, but some of it is a learning process, and how you can build in understanding your effectiveness in a situation that might change to me, speaks to a little more complexity in that. But I agree with you 100%. I mean, it's the nature of the funding. You have to honor that funding. You have responsibility. You're held in trust for the monies you receive from the federal government, and you should honor that. I believe that.
I have a little bit of a question that's sort of a follow-on. When I look at the goals of the networks to networks, the first one is accelerating scientific discovery. And my concern is one that I feel that we've fallen into in our RCN, that the first thing we always want to report is how many papers can we draw a straight line from our RCN to. And I'm worried that with ExcelNet, it's going to be more difficult to draw those straight lines. And these other goals, which, international engagement, leveraging resources, developing professional skills, and so on, they are harder to measure. And I'm wondering if at the end of the day there's some intimidation factor there, because publications are easy, and I have collaborators who run a different RCN, and what they've said to me repeatedly is, oh, NSF loves us because we have, so many publications from our RCN. And how can ExcelNet, is there a way that ExcelNet can help change the culture a little bit so we don't all just say our value is going to be in how many pubs we can draw a straight line to from this activity?
So, Claire, I want to make sure I give you the floor. Can I just talk a little bit about acceleration first? And so that word has been in our dictionary here. And in some ways, it's a real motivating factor. In some ways, it's an incredibly high hill to climb. What exactly does accelerate mean? And I think, and then there's this other piece of the things you count. As I said, we had very few papers when we first started. We have lots and lots and lots of publications that have come out of here, and they come every day, and then, so you get over that hump. And I'm very proud of those, and I think NSF is very happy about what we produce numerically and where they fit in the different scope of journals. I would tell you that's, and I want to be careful how I frame this. I think that's sufficient. It's necessary but not sufficient. What we're actually trying to figure out now is if those papers are different. What is it about them that represents something that showcases change in how research was done for having interacted with SESYNC? And that's a whole different research endeavor. It's sort of bibliometrics. I've got this fantastic bibliometrics and network person who's helping me puzzle through that. It's high-end analysis. It's co-citations, all those things. And that takes you beyond the counting to the qualitative piece. So I agree that it's really hard to know beyond counting what you should look at. And that's propelled us to think very carefully about how you measure and how you interact. So most of our evaluation is really not focused on things you can count. It's direct interviews with people. And most of what our evaluator does is case studies and interviews that talks about what's changed, where are you positioned now versus where you were before you interacted. And it's very hard and tricky to see change. It really is. So, Claire, please.
Actually, I'm going to invite you Claire, to come up. The next session, which we are perfectly timed to go into, is to open the floor and the live stream for questions for both John and Claire at this point. We do have some live stream questions.
So I'm going to pick up exactly where you left off with this qualitative, it's more than the counting of the publications, and really focus on how that, which is necessary, because that is how we report our scientific findings, so that has to be a part of it. But the question of, are those scientific findings, and there will be some time delay before they come out, are they pushing the field ahead? And we know from looking backwards at scientific discoveries that often there is a very long lag time between some initial fundamental research and others recognizing the importance of that research or being able to apply that research in a way that completely changes the field. And so ExcelNet has a very lofty goal for these networks of networks to accelerate the discovery. How and when that initial discovery that is churning at a faster rate is recognized in the scientific discipline is another question. And we know that there will be time delay. That is part of how science works. So we want to accelerate the process of discovery. You may, a decade later, really be able to show the impact of what was developed. And that is just science. But you can document the process of accelerating. Some of that may be in the publications, some of it will be in the connections that you're making. And these more process-oriented changes in how the research community is working together. And so I think I'll encourage you to be more creative in how you think about what you're documenting and how you are changing the research community, how it works together, and those are process-oriented things. So thinking of ways of how to document that, which later hopefully we'll be able to connect with some of the outcomes of the discoveries. That's ideally in the big picture for how anyone documents scientific progress. It's always a long game. So it's, be open, and we'll wait. NSF will be there.
Maybe I'll take an opportunity now to ask a live stream question for John. What type of participatory evaluation methods have you used? And how have you used evaluation outputs in center or program management?
Yeah, so after having given a lot of terminology, I'm not 100% sure I understand participatory evaluation methods. That's one I haven't seen. And if that refers to sort of focus groups with users and sort of direct interaction, we haven't done that much of that. Much of our external evaluations that directly interact with people who've been here are covered under human subject research. And there is, by design, a separation between us and them because there's potential for risk. If someone were to come back, we would not treat them equitably. So those are all fully anonymized. On the other hand, so the other part of the question is, have we used evaluation outputs in center or program management? And the answer is absolutely. We were getting sort of, I wouldn't say real time, but as short of a lag time input to us in the first few years about how programs were running. Was the postdoc program stood up correctly, and was it serving the needs? Were we providing capacity and services through the whole series of things we do here in ways that were helping teams, or were we failing? And we modified programs very, very quickly. It was quite daunting for a number of the staff here in the first couple of years because we would change programs, and there were some people who just didn't like it and didn't want to stay. It was daunting for the leadership because we were constantly churning around how do we improve. We do a little bit less of that now, but I would tell you we just got back in the last 6 months the first round of surveys and interview data from the second evaluation we've done under our second cooperative agreement. And there were lessons we learned from that, and we're already modifying. We're modifying some of our engagement around things like facilitation, around things like building better ways to link our data science team. And one of the messages, and we've learned it over and over again, and it might be relevant for some of the bigger networks as opposed to teams, is scientists don't like to ask for help. And so you have to find ways to get in the room and create enough trust so that they will let an outsider provide help. And if I don't know how many times I go into a room now and say, if you don't tell me, I can't help you. You're here, take advantage of us, but we need to know. And so that's something that we've learned over the years that we've been able to institutionalize in different ways.
Other questions for Claire or John?
Yeah. So sorry, I have to insist on the connection between the complexity and, in this case, the evaluation itself, right? So depending on the network, each network will have a degree of complexity. And actually, that's part of what in industry, we use continuously. We know the network, we know how complex it is. There are degrees that we actually identify. And that gives us kind of a metric, and then with that metric, then we know what to expect, right? Now, in this case, how would that or could that impact the evaluation process? We, for example, use results, objectives, and activities. So, and for each one, we have metrics, right? Some of them are easy to measure, some of them are very hard to measure. But given that we have a complexity also on the network itself, the more complex the network, then obviously that will have an impact, right, on the evaluation, right? So how can you maybe explain, that connection between evaluating a more complex network than a less complex network, right? So that type of evaluation.
Well, so complexity is to me is ultimately leads to uncertainty, right? It's harder to measure. There's more things that are going to impact what you try to do, and so that notion of goals, activities, outcomes, that sort of, and the methodology behind that, in many ways, I think, with less uncertainty, it's easier to measure. With more uncertainty, there are so many external factors that can come into play. So for me, I think, and you probably live in this world and could give me better examples than I can give you here. There are parts of our program that we feel like we can measure pretty easily. So for instance, we have a goal of advancing postdocs into and early career scholars into sustainable jobs. We can measure that in a variety of ways. It's not a simple thing to measure, but it's measurable. We have a more complex goal of increasing the capacity of individuals to do interdisciplinary research. How do you measure that? So are they publishing papers that have characteristics that are more interdisciplinary? Are they submitting proposals? Have their dispositions changed? So I think the questions get to be calibrated, and the time frame of when you can see change has to be calibrated in there as well. I'd love to hear you tell me how you think about measuring when you're in very complex systems, because when I first started thinking about measurements, I thought in those kind of stepwise progressions. We still use that, but our theory of change is pushing us into areas where it's just really hard to measure, and that's why and I don't want to diminish this, but it is storytelling in a lot of ways. So here's the other piece that is infinitely more complex than any of those, is influencing decisions. We care about actionable science. Much of the actionable science we want to impact falls outside of our horizon of accountability. It will take years. We have to align, so we're not an NGO. We don't make policy, but we want science to inform policy. That's a highly complex enterprise in a variety of ways, and you wait oftentimes for windows to open up. That's storytelling in a lot of ways. I wish I could tell you it's not, but there's validity in the storytelling. There's methods to think about that. It just takes a long time.
I appreciate Claire's comment about how NSF would be patient in terms of the time it would take for publications to come out. And I also recognize the concern that other people have and that pressure that one feels to be productive, and to please your funding agency, et cetera. The question that begets is there a danger in an opportunity like ExcelNet in including that, say, bibliometric analysis as part of the evaluation? Is there a risk in reviewers saying you may be getting ahead of yourself? This will take time, and so that may not be as valuable as another type of evaluation. Would you care to comment in that regard?
Well, I will say you're always expected to provide the publication list that's generated, whether you're adding that to your CV, whether you're adding that to your annual report. The expectation that you will provide a list of publications is going to be there. I think the question of when they come out, there may be reasons why it takes longer for them to come out. But what I think is not easily captured in those lists, and what's really important, is which of those publications are actually driving the field forward. We live in a time where there is massive journal proliferation, where there is the encouragement to break things down into the minimal publishable unit. Everyone's counting to such a degree that we are overemphasizing the numerics of publications and not the quality of the research. And so I think if you can come to the storytelling component of why publication X is significant for the field, that's what we want to understand, is not 10 publications, but which is really pushing the field ahead and why. So to just reiterate, that's, I think, a very important part of what you provide in annual reports or any communication across not only your research network, but to external stakeholders. And Is there any, how are we doing for time?
We've got time.
Okay, great. There's one thing I want to make sure I get to, but I don't want to push it yet.
So I know that some of this is outlined in the solicitation, but for you, Claire, as a program officer, if you were to look at a project, an ExcelNet project, at the end of the 5 years, if you could say these are the top three, these are three indicators of success, or this would be the legacy of ExcelNet projects once they've been completed. I mean, obviously, I think if the network dies after the project is over, then it really wasn't. I don't think it was a good project. I think that one of the things should be is that this network should continue to thrive and evolve at the end of the funding cycle. But beyond that, I mean, what would you say are sort of the three things that you would like to see as a legacy that's left?
Step back and say I might not view things in quite the same way. Particularly, I'll emphasize the catalytic level is both serving the needs to catalyze new networks of networks, but in the current solicitation, we also allow under that catalytic level more mature, established networks of networks to achieve a limited term goal. And in that case, if they met that goal in 3 years, it's done. There should not be a need to sustain that. And again, I think if the advancement of the field is achieved by having spent 5 years working at a fast and furious and intense pace, that network of network might not have the same needs to sustain the same level of engagement. If they had pushed the field over, whether it's a methodological issue, a theoretical framework issue, a tool issue, if they have pushed the field past whatever hump was preventing rapid advancement, the level of engagement could very well reasonably drop off. So sustainability of effort, but in and of itself, I don't think is needed. Everything is context dependent.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, then I'm going to pick up on something that looking at the logic models and so forth and the graphic representations, I started having a few churnings in my head thinking of how useful those are for a number of reasons. And it also got me thinking about ways that teams that are proposing could both graphically represent aspects of what their networks of networks do in a way that would convey to the stakeholders, being reviewers, and other members of that network of network leadership team, because we all need graphic representations to really grasp what are we tackling here. So I felt obviously logic models and that flow of inputs and outputs and activities is really useful. But another graphic representation that I think would help in both the planning stages and the presentation stages is to tackle the who, where, when, why, and the what. So who's being brought together in these networks of networks? You know, the researchers, the institutions, the countries involved, the leadership team component of those networks of networks, but also who are the participants in those activities? Are the participants coming from a different suite of institutions, a broader array of institutions? Where will they be brought together? So to really think about the who is involved and how those elements could be represented, both for the leadership, which is critical, but the broader participation of the networks of networks. And then the what resources are actually being leveraged, whether they are both the facilities and tools of research, or if they are education and training resources, the what is being leveraged across those networks of networks. And much of the why that they would be pulled together would be covered in a logic model in some fashion. But graphically representing those aspects gives the scope of the network of network and potentially suggests how they will interact in a way to achieve those synergies. So those may just be road mapping tools that people sit down and do together on paper, but I think it could help organize thoughts and feed into how you describe aspects of your work. They may end up being graphical representations that you could actually use to show reviewers and others handling your proposal how the network of networks works together. But I could see them being useful planning tools for you as well.
Yeah, so thank you for commenting on that. So on the graphical representation side, so and this is more on the network and complexity theory side of things, this is very well connected to, for example, graph theory, right? So many of these models are actually being represented that way. So there are tools available and there are standards somehow available for doing that. Would that help to maybe, I don't know, agree on some type of standard representation of these models using what industry is already using or some other research projects that are already using? Or are we just free to suggest whatever graphical representation we think is the best, to communicate the impact or operation of the network?
I would say that from the perspective of most of NSF programs, we typically shy away from being very prescriptive, partly because allowing you to choose what you do and how you present it helps reviewers see what your level of thinking is, so it's useful in that regard. If we're so prescriptive, the creativity and the thought processes of the teams is less apparent, and it's incredibly informative. For both talks, just thank you again. And we will just conclude a little bit early, which I know will be heartbreaking for everyone on a Friday at lunchtime. But I thought we'd with just a couple of thoughts to kind of wrap up the past 2 days. We began this workshop with the assumption that you, participants here in the room, speakers, participants on the live stream, you know your science. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about research questions because you're the experts who bring that to the table. The focus of this workshop, rather, was to talk about human components of networks, behavior, organizational components, and get a sense of the kind of thoughtful concepts that might help people understand as they scale up from small-scale scientific endeavors into larger international networks of networks. We saw examples throughout the presentations and the conversation that we had over the past 2 days of networks at different scales, different disciplines, different levels of transdisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity, and we were offered various resources that could help us think about what might be coming barriers to developing international networks of networks or scaling up existing networks.
I just wanted to point out a couple of key themes that I saw that came across the presentations and through our conversation. One of the things that jumped out, even as I spoke to people before people came here, was the importance of identifying people who coordinate, manage, and administer, who are not the driving scientific researchers in thinking about coordinating networks of networks. I heard a lot of discussion around techniques to consider behavioral processes that make for successful collaborations. We talked a lot about the importance of thoughtful communication strategies, how to cultivate trust and transparency as key components to those strategies. The need for flexibility to accommodate change as teams and networks evolve as an important characteristic in thinking about moving forward with networks of networks. And we saw examples for building competencies and capacity for the next generation and early career leaders who can take up the mantle of increasingly extant networks of researchers that are required to tackle coming scientific problems. So I just wanted to kind of point out some of the themes that I saw that cut across all of the presentations and seem to cut across the different scales of networks that we talked about over the past couple of days. So having said that, I'd like to thank you all for coming and tuning in, and thank NSF for supporting this workshop. And just with some practical information, let you know that the live stream sessions will be available soon and posted on our website along with the presentations and other resources that were mentioned over the past couple of days. And for folks in the room, make sure you take your reimbursement forms. And there is lunch at the back of the room. And thank you for coming.